When we left off, a 27-year-old Rachmaninoff was just recovering from a major episode of depression which lasted several years. During that time, it was almost impossible for him to compose anything, but with the help of a doctor, Nikolai Dahl, he was able to put himself back on his feet and start composing again. His first major work after all this was his second piano concerto, which understandably was dedicated to Dr. Dahl. The Satins, especially the Satin children, had become Rachmaninoff's most intimate and trusted friends. His cousin, Natalia Satina, had continued her piano studies, first with Zverev and then graduating at the conservatory. This must have given her an extra bond with Rachmaninoff, and it was no surprise to their family when they announced their engagements. The difficulties, however, were formidable. First cousins were forbidden marriage within the Orthodox Church, and to many, the news of disengagement was like a bomb explosion. All were aware of the many obstacles to this marriage, family, civical, clerical, but somehow these were all overcome. He even needed a permission from the Tsar in order to go forth with the marriage, and this petition had to be sent during the marriage ceremony itself, for if the Tsar should refuse, no priest would agree to perform the marriage. Everything, however, worked out in the end, and on April 29, 1902, Rachmaninoff brought an end to the Bohemian chapter of his life. With the spring rain pouring outside, he married Natalia Satina in an army chapel of suburban Moscow, with Alexander Siloti as best man. After their honeymoon in October, the couple settled in Moscow, where they bought a small apartment. The busy year's work was displayed in a concert given on February 10th, 1903 for the Ladies' Charity Prison Committee. A critic wrote of Rachmaninoff and his new piano works. Of the new compositions, the most congenial impression was made by three of the preludes distinct in character: F sharp minor, D major, and G flat major. Much less interesting, at least on first acquaintance, seemed the larger work, Variations on a Theme by Chopin. The variations, though significant, are not always worthy of the beautiful theme that inspired them. The public reception was more encouraging, however. He also made a successful debut in Vienna, playing the new second concerto with the Vienna Philharmonic. The Rachmaninoff's first child was born on May 14th, a daughter, Irina, and the augmented family spent the summer of 1903 at the Ivanovka estate. Right after, however, Rachmaninoff complained about being ill the whole summer and being able to work on almost nothing. He did focus on one thing that year, and that was an opera, The Miserly Knight, based on Pushkin's disguised attack on his own selfish father. In the spring of 1904, for a variety of reasons, Rachmaninoff signed a contract to conduct at the Bolshoi Theatre, not for years, as was customary, but for 5 months, without superseding Altani, the old Italian conductor at the Bolshoi. The news of even so brief a contract for Rachmaninoff aroused speculation, anxiety, eagerness, and antagonism in various quarters. Conservatory circles expressed their displeasure in diplomatic ways, spreading gossip that no one could work peacefully with Rachmaninoff, that he was too demanding, too severe, too inflexible. One music critic wrote that Rachmaninoff was burning his candle at 3 ends. One of these burning ends was as an opera conductor. The Miserly Knight had been completed in February, and his plan was to add to this another short opera, finish it before beginning work at the Bolshoi Theatre, and produce the two together there by the end of the year. In collaboration with Modest Tchaikovsky, Pyotr's younger brother, who wrote the libretto for Francesca de Rimini, in May 1904, Rachmaninoff began work on his new opera. A choice eventually had to be made between completing Francesca and studying the scores of the season's operas, which he was to conduct fairly soon. He, however, chose to finish his opera Francesca. A Life for the Tsar was not to be the first opera conducted at the Bolshoi Theatre by Rachmaninoff, but it was to be one of the most important events of the opera season. In 60 years of performances, this Glinka opera had gone through many changes, some even becoming hallowed by repetition and transformed into tradition, though they violated some of the composer's ideas. Early in 1904, a special commission had been formed to supervise the Bolshoi Theater's revival of the opera on the occasion of the centenary of Glinka's birth. There was a lot of interest in the potentialities of Rachmaninoff's first season with the Imperial Theaters, and he was appointed to the post of musical director of this performance. At the beginning of his term, he was allowed only 2 rehearsals for a repertory opera, but for this revival, which involved new sets and new costumes, he was allowed 7 rehearsals. By the time of the performance, he had established a common language with the singers, musicians, and of great importance in this new work was his long-standing friendship with Chaliapin. The opera chosen to introduce Rachmaninoff to the Bolshoi audience was Dargomirski's Rusalka, one of the Rachmaninoff-Chaliapin successes at the Mamontov Opera 7 years before. The great surprise, however, for the audience on the evening of September the 3rd was to see that the conductor's chair had been moved from its old familiar place between stage and orchestra pit, with the conductor's back to the musicians. For the first time in an Imperial Russian opera house, the conductor faced both orchestra and singers, an innovation first shown in Russia by that radical Wagner. The new position soon became an established custom in Imperial opera after Rachmaninoff's gesture. Rachmaninoff introduced changes of more significance during his tenure, such as insisting that young people be trained as apprentice conductors and that the conductors study roles with the individual soloists, but Russian history remembers best that novelty of the conductor's chair. Working for the Imperial Theaters was no simple matter. Rachmaninoff writes, "The enormous complexity of dancers, musicians, chorus singers, and soloists at the Bolshoi Opera was under the management of the Directorate of the Imperial Theaters, whose Moscow offices occupied an entire building not far from the theater. Frankly speaking, this office gave me little pleasure in my dealings with it. Too much red tape and endless official written communications were required. Even a minor request involved one in a huge apparatus of reports." On September the 21st, the Glinka anniversary performance of A Life for the Tsar was given, the 478th performance of this opera in Moscow. A critic writes, "If not an ideal life for the Tsar, it was such as Moscow had not heard for a long time. There were new sets, new costumes, but the main thing was a talented new conductor with fresh ardor, Mr. Rachmaninoff, who gave new power to all performance from soloists to chorus and orchestra." Other successful installments rolled out one after the other. To win a conductor meant to lose temporarily a composer. In later years, Rachmaninoff summed up his career. "The whole time of my musical activity thus far, some 24 years, might be divided roughly into 3 periods of approximately 8 years each of composing, concert work, and conducting. When I am concerting, I cannot compose. When I feel like writing music, I have to concentrate on that. I cannot touch the piano. When I am conducting, I can neither compose nor play concerts. Other musicians may be more fortunate in this respect, but I have to concentrate to such a degree on one thing I am doing that it does not seem to allow me to take up anything else." At the beginning of the 20th century, the thought of political change and revolution was starting to take shape in Russia, and Russian musicians added to these early rumblings in 1905. On February the 2nd, 32 musicians, including Rimsky-Korsakov, Chaliapin, Taneyev, Rachmaninoff, and Siloti, signed and published a declaration. "When life is in shackles, art cannot be free. When there is no freedom of thought, no freedom of religion, no freedom of expression, and no freedom of the press, all living artistic ideas of the nation are constrained, and creative art withers. The title of free artist then becomes a bitter mockery. We are not free artists, but victims of the present abnormal conditions, deprived of civil rights as much as the rest of Russia's citizens. There is but one way out of this impasse. Russia must at long last enter the path of basic reforms." In the summer of the same year, 1905, Rachmaninoff's chief musical duty was the scoring of Francesca, for his 2 short operas were now scheduled for the coming season. After managing to finish that up, the time to leave Moscow and the Bolshoi Theatre came at last. His first important job this season was to conduct not his 2 operas, but Rimsky-Korsakov's new opera, Pan Voyevoda, a work that Rachmaninoff did not wholly admire. "The music is poor, but the instrumentation is stupendous," he said. The premiere took place on September the 26th, and it was well received. Rachmaninoff's association with Rimsky-Korsakov gave him a totally new outlook on the importance of this composer who Moscow-trained musicians tended to underestimate. He would write about this late in 1933. "His mastery of the technique of composition, especially his skill in instrumentation and his sensitive control of tone color, filled me with admiration. I grew really fond of him, and this feeling deepened day to day. To this day, my appreciation of his music has not reached its limits. My association with Rimsky-Korsakov taught me a great deal. I was given more than one opportunity to verify his incredibly fine ear for orchestral detail." The political situation in Russia became more and more troublesome. The government encroached on nearly every public institution, including the Bolshoi Theatre, who was starting to feel this more and more. Rachmaninoff argued about how some of the musicians should simply be replaced, saying that certain musicians not only do not fit in this orchestra but actually injure it. But that could not be done. His frustration grew and grew, and it seems scarcely surprising that before the end of the season, Rachmaninoff carried out his threat to end the contract with the Imperial Theatres for good, and to get far away at once from the political heat and noise of 1906. It was Italy, the hospitable refuge of Russian composers, that received the Rachmaninoff family in March, but it was a vacation that would be looked back on with little pleasure. He was torn between choosing from a few contracts still unsigned, one of them involving concerting in America and others involving him stay in Europe, mostly in Moscow. In a letter, he writes, "It seems that nothing will work out with America. I think they want to squeeze me. I've sent them an ultimatum with a month's deadline. Incidentally, I absolutely need America if I give up the Moscow offers. Without one or the other, I can't exist. Which should I hold on to? I cling to America, not only because it would bring a good amount of money, but mostly because it demands only 2 months. But suppose I am cheated there and I compose nothing. Thus my perpetual refrain." At the beginning of summer, the Rachmaninoffs in Florence had a visitor from Moscow, one of their cousins, who later wrote of a birth of a popular piano work. "The days were sultry. The Venetian blinds remained lowered on windows and doors. The streets were empty. Whenever the heat relaxed a little, the first to appear on the street were a young man poorly dressed with a silk top hat and a cane, and a woman in brightly colored dresses. A tiny donkey with very long ears pulled an upright mechanical piano on wheels, and a crib with a baby in it was attached to the piano. The young man sang popular ballads and the woman cranked the piano. They were street musicians. Our favorite number in their repertoire was a simple yet quite melodious polka. Many years later, when I heard Rachmaninoff's Polka Italienne, I knew where it had first entered his consciousness." Rachmaninoff ended up refusing his tour in America. Not long after, trying to concentrate more on his composition, he decided a change in scenery was necessary. He had decided to move to Dresden. So long as he spent the winter in Russia, he would be forced to do the one thing that hindered his composition most: work on the music of others. Nothing else was so great an obstacle, not even the hectic social life of a Moscow winter with its inevitable turmoils and wastes. Taking his wife and daughter to Dresden was not a move away from responsibility, but a move toward work.